My name's Lewis, 27 years old. I graduated from University of California, Berkeley, majoring in museum collections and studies. A few months ago, I was transferred to work in the Smithsonian, one of the most well-known museums in the United States. Since I would be working in R&D here, I felt pretty excited about it. On my first day of work, I decided to have a walk around the museum, seeing the vast collection of it. I happened to come across Fiona, an employee who was the same age as mine, with 1 year experience. She also shared the same position as I was. We got to know each other and quickly felt like a good match. Fiona showed me around the place, introducing the artifacts along the way. To be honest, I wasn't paying much attention to the things she said. I was more attracted to her joyous face and those beautiful brown eyes. A few minutes later, we're given tasks by administration to receive the latest artifacts just arriving this morning. Fiona took me to the artifact collection room. In this room, there's a lot of very, very precious artifacts of huge historical value, requiring great care and handling. Fiona would run through the initial inspection while I did the note-taking for categorization. The last artifact we received was a wooden cube with strange marking on the surface. Each side measured about 1.3 feet. The object was made of wood, covered in a rather thick layer of dust. We felt kind of weird about this artifact. None of us had any information about it. On the right side, there was a rotatable metal knob. I guess it was the artifact opening mechanism, so I did turn it a bit, trying to open it. Fiona immediately voiced her concern, yet it was too late, for I had already committed. For each turn came a small click, as if you're winding up an antique music box. I was fascinated by this object, while Fiona was really spooked by this. The knobs had been turned all the way and no longer moved at all. I and Fiona attentively watched over the box. There wasn't anything happening after a few seconds. Then, suddenly, a clown jumped out from the box, followed by a sinister laughter. Startled, Fiona fell backward, which also startled me. There was a rather big clown shoved within the classic jack-in-the-box, giving out a grin, bobbing back and forth on the spring-powered mechanism. Fiona was disturbed by the laughter, in stark contrast to my fascination. The clown figure was kinda ugly. Creepy dark reflection with two big sunken dark eyes. The clown had a wide open gape, which the sinister laughter came from. To be honest, it's kinda creepy when you see it further and further. My guess was this jack-in-the-box was an antique toy, which we quickly left aside to focus onto our work. It was the first day of work. Because I want to show off a little bit with my new colleague, I stayed all the way late into the night, until both of us were exhausted by the work after tons of documentation about all the artifacts. So I decided to invite Fiona to dinner, which she declined, for her boyfriend would come to pick her up. Oh, it was a bummer. Fiona had a boyfriend already. So she left the scene first, leaving me alone with bitter disappointment. The next day I went to work early, opening the office with the jack-in-the-box right in front of my door. Okay, who left it here? Because aside from me and Fiona last night, nobody would be here ever since, huh? Fiona arrived right after that, and when I asked her about the box, she wasn't sure either. Ever since we're out of the office yesterday, nobody would touch it then. After a quick inspection, we found that the box remained intact. We left it aside and dived into our work. Around lunchtime, I came to the archive room and unexpectedly, the box appeared there again. This time, I did a more careful observation of the object. There was some unintelligible marking on the box, as well as a number 0 on the top of it. This object really intrigued me. It must be someone really intrigued by it in the museum staffs that they left it all over the place like this. Suddenly, the knob rotating on itself, clicking over each knot. This startled me, frozen me on my track. glued my gaze into the strange artifact. Fiona then called my name from afar and snapped me out of my trance. The box suddenly stopped turning on its own, too. Fiona asked me why I was idling for such a long time. I answered back with my experience and questions about the mysterious box. She put that aside immediately, telling me about the incoming expo. We would have a lot of work to do. The mysterious box was an unnecessary distraction. I left. Nonetheless, questions about the box ringing within my head. That day, we finished our work very late. Yet we're contented. We'd made good preparation for the incoming exhibition. So needless to say our frustration when we arrived to work the next day. Everything we'd prepared was now all over the place, some heavily damaged with blood running all over. In the corner was a body of a robust man, wearing dark clothes with a black-colored balaclava that was now torn heavily from his badly bruised and lacerated body. On his neck was a bite mark that was too wide and deep. The bite mark clearly wasn't of human origin. The police arrived quickly, cordoned off the crime scene, and we had no other choice but to cancel the exhibition. The museum suffered heavily due to many precious artifacts suffering irreparable damage. A quick investigation told us that the dead man was indeed a museum thief. Cause of death was announced to be heavy exsanguination, yet the evidence toward the perpetrator was nowhere to be found. The police kept every one of us round up for investigation. The days afterward were hell. None of us, me and Fiona including, could have enjoyed the atmosphere here. And the creepy things didn't stop there. Another day, our project manager also disappeared. He hadn't been around for many days now. Also, no traces of him running away were discovered. I had just been working for half a month, but many bad things had been going on here already. One late night, when I was walking across the hallway to go home, suddenly I spotted something down in the darkness. Attentively listening, I immediately recognized it to be the Jack-in-the-Box. I wasn't wrong. It was right there, down the hallway. I suddenly felt something wasn't right about this artifact. Carefully picked it up. I could feel the knob automatically turning. The sensation made the hair on my back puff up. Even weirder, I could see the number on it slowly turning into number 2. Suddenly, over the dark corridor, there appeared a dark shadow, which seemed to be a man, a very tall man, dressed up in raggedly strange clothes. I stopped dead on my track in a sudden dread, before slowly regaining my composure, getting closer, and yelling out to see who that person was. A loud, crazy laughter echoed from the dark corridor, hit me like a truck, prompted me to drop the box onto the floor. The laughter was exactly like the one from the Jack-in-the-Box. I was frozen and dead, unable to move any muscles. On the other side, as soon as Fiona called out for me, the shadow and the creepy laughter disappeared. Instead, it was her silhouette appearing on the wall. Everything happened way too fast for me to know what happened. I wasn't sure if it was real or just all my imagination. So I decided not to tell Fiona what had happened. But I told her that I was going to put the Jack-in-the-Box aside to archive room and head home soon. When I headed for home, Fiona was there waiting for her boyfriend. The next morning, Fiona didn't go to work. I was shocked when I was told that Fiona had been admitted to the ER last night. When I came to visit, Fiona was in a deep coma with countless wounds on her body. On her neck was a similar bite mark to that dead museum thief. Her boyfriend told me when he came to pick her up, he heard a call for help and some crazy laughter in the dark. When he found her, she was already in a deep shock, blood covered all over her body. I came back to work with a lot of thoughts in my head. First thing first, I needed to test my theory. so I brought out the box, seeing the number lingering between 2 and 3. So if Fiona completely passed away from the assault, the number would completely turn to 3? I decided to turn the box's knob, prompting the creepy figure to pop out, which I looked at closely, trying to figure out what it truly was. Later this afternoon, the police discovered the body of our project manager on the rooftop of the museum complex. He died due to the combination of blood loss and similar wounds, just like Fiona and the thief. Also, at the same day, a man with a lot of wounds and healing scars came forward to meet me. He confessed to be the second thief of that night and luckily survived the attack. He wanted me to discuss a few things. I took him into my office under the escort of the police. The man could no longer exude his emotion after the badly mauled face, yet I could read the fear, the terror within his eyes. His name's Owen, and the other thief who couldn't make it was Gary. That night, they planned the heist meticulously, and Gary, upon seeing the box, put it into the trophy bag. It was almost perfect, until suddenly, the creepy laughter came together with the sound of a winding knob. Owen could clearly remember the giant of a man, dressed up in an ancient outfit of a clown, a jester, attacking both of them. He was supposed to be another victim, but he fought tooth and nail to escape death. Owen lifted up his sleeve, showing up a giant bite mark, still bloodied, and had no time to heal yet. I knew Owen came to me due to the fact that I was the only one who would believe him. As we were exchanging our words, suddenly, the jester's creepy laugh echoed from the dark corner. We turned around and were greeted with the sight of the Jack-in-the-Box. Okay, how the hell did that thing come here without any of us noticing? The terror-induced clown stood looking at us, twisted and turned its body side to side as if taunting us. Do you think that Lewis and Owen could have escaped the attack of the clown? What would happen to Fiona? Let's discuss in the comments section below. I'm Elon. I'm a high school student in Houston, Texas. I'm an open-minded individual and quite enjoy extracurricular activities at school. One time, my class was informed that they would participate in a community service cleanup session at a local park. Even though I wasn't very excited, being able to run outside was better than having to sit and study, I thought. It was Sunday morning. We arrived at the park at 9 o'clock and were assigned areas to clean. This park has just been built in recent weeks, and there are still some areas in the finishing stages. Me, Anna, and Max were assigned to clean up an area with a very large rock. It was high above my head and placed in a small flower garden. I observed the rock and saw that it had a very strange shape. There's also a cross engraved on the stone, but it seems to be upside down. I told Anna and Max, but they didn't pay attention to what I said. I guess I'm no expert in landscaping, I muttered. Ignoring the stone's strange appearance, we started cleaning. Max and Anna picked grass in the flower garden, and I will plant a few new flowers. We do this while chatting about interesting stories at school. As it neared the end, I started to smell a terrible stench. It was really nauseating. Anna and Max also noticed that unpleasant smell. We went around the area we were responsible for to find out the source, but didn't find anything unusual. At the end of the labor session, all of us were told to regroup. My team has thoroughly checked the area we are in charge of, so we are confident that everything is clean. It was probably some dead mice somewhere else, and the wind brought in the stench. We told each other that and happily left. A few days later, we organized a picnic ourselves at the park we cleaned. this time with Ethan and Mary. Returning to the flower garden the other day, we were happy because the newly planted flower trees were lush. My friends and I spread out the carpet next to it, ate together, chatted, and took pictures. About 15 minutes later, it suddenly started to rain. We quickly packed up our things and ran to a nearby shack to shelter from the rain. Where we were standing outside the rock, a brown liquid began flowing out. The stench rose again. This time it was much worse. We were stunned to see that strange thing and looked at each other, confusing and scared. About 20 minutes later, the rain stopped. Me, Max, and Ethan came closer for a better look. Mary and Anna fearfully huddled in the shack. Even though I was scared, a feeling of curiosity was taking over me. Reaching out to brush a few flower plants next to the rock away, a feeling of dizziness immediately hits me. I saw human fingers crushed under the stone and they were decomposing. I screamed out in fear, almost to a panic attack, crawled out to yell at my friends to quickly call the police. The police arrived and immediately searched the scene. Max and I stayed behind to give our statements to the police, while Ethan took Anna and Mary home first because they were so panicked. The police found out that there was a body crushed underneath and immediately sent the tow to move the stone away. Seeing the entire scene unfold, I was shocked to the core by the corpse underneath. The body was no longer in one piece. It was decomposing. The stench and sight was horrifying to witness. The police thanked Max and I for the cooperation, then told us to go home first. Maybe during construction the stone was placed in a different position and collapsed over the poor worker while he was inspecting the project. So my feeling about the stone's strange position is correct. The man's body was processed and returned to his family. That stone was later demolished by the park management board and a flower garden was planted in its place. To this day, that scene still haunts me. Extracurriculars now brings me the dreads. I always imagined that I would discover another terrible thing around there. I am Roger, 39 years old. I've been working as a delivery driver for UPS for 8 years now. The job is quite demanding, requiring me to be physically fit and flexible with my time. But in return, I have a decent income to support my family. One evening, I received an urgent overtime request from management. It was already past 10 p.m., so I quickly changed into my uniform and left home without saying a word to my wife. I arrived at the company at 10:30 p.m. where the manager hurriedly called me over. He was Peter, a kind and cheerful manager, 4 years older than me. Peter handed me a delivery order sheet. Peter was wearing a mask, coughing continuously, and his behavior was quite strange. He said that this delivery was directly assigned by him because it was urgent and very important. However, Peter was running a high fever, so he trusted me to take over this delivery. Before I could read the delivery address, the quantity of goods, or the delivery time, Peter said he had already checked everything for me. I quickly drove to the delivery address without much time to spare. I followed Peter's instructions, eager to get on the road. I would double-check the address while driving. Glancing at the delivery address, I was a bit surprised. It was in Boston, Massachusetts, about 200 kilometers northeast of my current location. The items were cosmetics and dietary supplements. The customer requested delivery within 3 hours. I wondered how important it could be to require delivery at such a late hour. I encouraged myself to try to complete the delivery early and go home to rest. Looking at the clock in the car, it was almost 1 a.m., and I was starting to feel sleepy. I usually have coffee prepared in the car, but that night, it was all gone without me noticing. With no rest stops in sight, I turned up the rock music. hoping it would keep me alert. The loud music didn't make me any more awake, but at least it kept me from getting drowsier. I slowed down a bit to ensure safety. Suddenly, I heard someone, though I couldn't tell if they were whispering, moaning, or crying. It must have been background noise from the song I was listening to, as it spoke of the heartache of a lovelorn boy. I brushed it off and continued driving, searching for a rest stop. After a stretch of Henry Road, I finally came across a rest area. Just as I turned off the music, I heard the sound of dripping water. I startled, thinking about the possibility of the cosmetics encountering an issue. I quickly got out of the car to check the cargo. Luckily, everything seemed fine, probably just my sleepiness getting to me. But these bottles of cosmetics had a strong chemical smell. I went into the convenience store next to the rest area, bought a pastry and a hot coffee. Now I was truly awake. With 80 kilometers left to go, I was confident I could deliver this shipment on time. But then I got lost on a rough dirt road with large rocks causing the car to shake violently. I heard the glass bottles under the trunk clinking against each other, making my heart skip a beat. I'd have to pay a hefty sum if I damaged the customer's goods. The road was too dark. The car hit a large rock and jolted. The sound of breaking glass echoed. On reflex, I hit the brakes, turning back to the trunk with a look of horror on my face. But what I saw next terrified me even more. I saw Peter, my manager, with a pale face, his eyes dripping with blood. I slammed on the brakes as hard as I could, trying to widen my eyes to see clearly, but Peter was gone. The feeling of seeing a ghost doesn't compare to seeing someone you know, but they're in a horrifying state. It took me a few minutes for my stiff body to move again, but my heart was still pounding so hard I could hardly breathe. I panicked, my limbs unsure of what to do to keep driving. I kept pressing the accelerator, the car speeding faster, making me even more frantic. I reached out, pressing every button, the horn, the turn signals, the headlights. But my foot remained firmly on the accelerator. Ahead was a large tree. I was still accelerating, the car reaching speeds of up to 80 kilometers an hour. Luckily, I managed to hit the brakes in time. The car screeched to a halt, the entire force thrusting forward, the cargo compartment echoing with the sound of tearing bags and a series of crashes. I knew I had just caused something horrifying. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, I breathed heavily, trying to regain my composure, the strong smell of bleach wafting up from the cargo. I stepped out of the car almost holding my breath, slowly opening the cargo door and shining my flashlight. A mixture of bleach and the metallic smell of blood spilled out from the inside. As I shone the flashlight inside, a man in uniform similar to mine lay amidst numerous bottles and jars, his body covered in blood. As I slowly illuminated the area, I saw blood flowing from his chest, 3 wounds resembling gunshot wounds in the center of his chest. And the most horrifying thing was, he was my manager, Peter. My entire body went limp. I lost the ability to control myself. Even my brain seemed to stop functioning for a few minutes. I don't remember how I managed to return to the driver's seat. It was only after I finished calling the police that I noticed my phone screen was covered in blood and dirt. My hands were scratched, with some fingers even torn with nails. Only then did I feel the pain. When the police arrived, I couldn't remain conscious enough to answer any more of their questions. The horrifying events didn't stop there. My company office was reported to have caught fire that very night. The police suspect that the person I encountered that evening was one of my colleagues at the company, pretending to be a manager. He took advantage of my trust, deceived me into taking the body far away, then set fire to destroy all evidence and fled. The police are still searching for the whereabouts of that cold-blooded murderer. I requested a 2-week leave to stabilize my mental state, and afterward, I was promoted to manager by the company. It's been 13 years, but the image of Peter that dark night still haunts me. The killer still hasn't been caught. He could be lurking somewhere, observing my life. I lived with my parents and sister in a small town, right on the edge of the state. Ever since I was a kid, my dad didn't really have much interest or time for the family. My mom and sister always got to me with their cold and dismissive comments. When I was 20, after finishing a college program in programming, my mom and sister were always against me leaving home, even though I'd been old enough to make that decision for a couple of years. I got a job at a supermarket in the center of town, over 9 miles from home. I decided to rent a cheap apartment close to my job. Instead of supporting me, my mom and sister were annoyed and kept telling me I'd never be able to do anything. I'm guessing he'll be back in a month since he probably doesn't have enough money to cover the rent. My sister said that, but I just kept quiet. I'm determined to show them I can do more than they think. Unfortunately, I ended up moving back home just like she said, but not after 1 month, after 3 months instead. I didn't give up and was determined to live the free life I wanted. Then I announced that I was moving again because I'd found a job in my field in another city. This time, my mom and sister's reaction was even harsher. They came up with all sorts of crazy reasons to try to stop me from going through with my plan. My mom kept saying that I didn't love her and didn't care about my family. At that time, I only had enough money to get to the city where I was going to live, but it was still better than staying at home. For a week before I left, my mom kept trying to use herself as an excuse to change my mind. But when she saw that those things weren't working on me, she decided to agree. On the day I left, my dad was busy with work and wasn't home, so my mom and sister saw me off. My mom made me some cold cuts and packed up a few other things for me. I was hoping for more, like some words of encouragement or a little financial help, but I guess I was asking for too much, even though I was used to how my mom and sister treated me. My mom carefully packed 2 boxes of noodles and some other food and told me to keep them safe while I was traveling. I thought I'd never been pampered by my mom like that before. In the first few days in the new place, everything felt strange and unfamiliar. And there were times when I felt really homesick. I struggled with covering living expenses and getting around. When I grabbed a pack of cold cuts my mom gave me, I noticed something weird. Like the lid had been opened before, or it was torn. It didn't taste right to me, or maybe it was spoiled. But I think it was mostly just the taste, since I've never really liked cold cuts. About 20 minutes after dinner, I was getting ready to take a shower when I suddenly felt really nauseous. My head was spinning, and I had a bit of trouble breathing. I'd felt this way before, and I was trying to remember exactly when. The phone rang. It was my mom. Her first call since I moved out 4 days ago.
Have you eaten the food I packed for you?
Those were the first words she said when I picked up the phone. I ate a little, but it...
Make sure you eat everything. Good night.
After exactly 3 sentences, my mom hung up, without waiting for me to finish or asking about how I was doing. My nausea and dizziness just kept getting worse. I ran to the bathroom, threw up everything in my stomach, and kept splashing water on my face. I stood on the toilet, gasping for breath, and then sat down on the floor. After about 15 minutes, I started to feel a bit better. I took a hot shower and went to bed early. The next morning, I still felt nauseous, but I had to go to work. A friendly colleague gave me a pack of cookies to snack on when he noticed I was tired. When I took the first bite, I froze for a few seconds because I recognized the taste. It was similar to the pack of cookies my sister gave me recently. After eating those cookies, I felt nauseous and uncomfortable, just like yesterday. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on work. In the evening, I ended up buying fast food instead of eating the stuff my mom gave me. I looked online to check what might be causing my symptoms and see if there was a health issue. When I saw the results, I was just speechless. It could be a sign of cyanide poisoning. A call from my mom popped up on my phone screen. I felt shivers, pain, and fear when I saw the name Mammy with a red heart next to it on my screen. I didn't answer the call. I just stared at the phone screen until the ringing stopped. A few seconds later, the screen lit up again with the text message. "Have you finished eating?" That message felt like a solid confirmation of everything I'd been speculating. That night I cried a lot, until after 2 a.m. I quickly pulled myself together and tried to do well at work. The calls and messages from my mom and sister kept coming in more frequently and urgently, but I still chose to stay silent. Once, my dad called me, so I picked up, briefly told him about my situation, and then hung up. I didn't want to see my family again and didn't want to clarify my suspicions. I could not face it. More than 2 months later, on the bus ride home from work, I ran into my mom. The bus was pretty crowded, and my mom was sitting in the last row, giving me a cold stare. I quickly got off at the nearest stop, grabbed a taxi, and told the driver to hurry. After that meeting, I moved to a different state far away. No one knew where I lived, except for my best friend. I needed him to help me with a few things back home. More than a month after I'd settled in with work and accommodation, everything was going well, and that's when I received the test results. I wasn't related to them by blood. I also found out that my adoptive mom had bought me a life insurance policy worth up to $300,000. The beneficiary of the insurance payout after my death was my adoptive mom. This is the terrible story I will tell on Halloween. I'm Jane, 21 years old, working for an auto garage in town. Just like every year, the streets, shops, and homes are filled with Halloween decorations. One morning while walking, I was attracted to a group of people gathering on the sidewalk. When we got closer to see, people were enjoying themselves, taking pictures with a mannequin hanging from a tree. The mannequin was female, wearing a white dress with lots of stains and long, scraggly brown hair, body covered in bruises. The face was pale with a haunting expression, her saucer eyes wide open, mouth wide open with bleeding stains. I and everyone there were amazed at such an uncanny and realistic mannequin. I also enjoy taking photos with the mannequin, then sharing it on social networks to immerse in the Halloween atmosphere. My photo quickly had a large amount of interactions. "Yo, it's really like that girl's hanging right behind you." Reading that comment from a friend, I laughed out loud. One evening, about 3 days later, I was on my way home from work, quite late because the shop was very busy that day. There was a group of people gathering on the street. I slowed down and realized that was the place where the famous mannequin was decorated. It was well known for its realistic details, I thought, until I saw a cop car parked nearby. Out of curiosity, I got out of the car to find out what's going on. Trying to squeeze through the scene before my eyes was so terrifying that I immediately felt nauseous. The mannequin had her flesh torn and skin dangling and was now crawling with maggots, and a terrible stench arose. Its face was also much paler and seemed to be puffing out. "Oh my God, that's a real person, not a Halloween decoration." The people standing around started talking to each other. Immediately, I shivered, a cold running down my spine. The police are blocking the scene and asking everyone to disperse to make it easier for the coroners to investigate. I returned home haunted by that woman's appearance. Looking back at the photo, I realized I was taking a photo with a hanging corpse. She was looking at me as if she knew I was looking at her through the phone. The creepy smile was full of blood. The eyes were full of pain and hatred. I was startled and zoomed in on the photo to look closely. That creepy smile has since disappeared. I hastily deleted the photo and tried to do chores around the house to not think about it anymore. But that whole evening, I was constantly haunted by a feeling of uneasiness that I don't know why is there. I went to my room early, trying to relieve my anxiety by playing games. After a while, I decided to go downstairs to get some snacks. As soon as I looked towards the door, I was startled and screamed loudly when I saw the silhouette of a woman wearing a white dress with long flowing hair at the door. "Are you all right?" It turned out to be my mother. My heart skipped a beat. I acted as if nothing happened. I told my mother it was okay, and I went to bed and covered myself with the blanket. I don't remember what time it was when I woke up. The feeling of something touching my hair and nose makes me uncomfortable. As I slowly opened my eyes, I saw a foot hovering right in front of me. I looked up. The hanging woman's body was looking at me with a rotten face and a bloody smile. I was so scared that I couldn't open my mouth or move. Suddenly, the body's head fell right in front of me. That smile and eyes right before my eyes. I jolted from my bed with all my strength, eyes still closed shut, screamed my lungs out. I ran down to the living room. The loud scream woke everyone in my home up. The whole night my parents were with me because I was so panicked. 2 days later, the town news reported on the incident that the decorative mannequin on the street was actually the corpse of a hanged woman. The girl's identity was discovered. Her name was Hannah, 20 years old. She was murdered by her vile, cruel, junkie boyfriend. After that, I was traumatized by girls with long hair wearing white clothes, especially white dresses. One evening, I worked overtime at the garage. At that time, around 11 a.m., a Toyota Camry entered the garage with its warning lights flashing continuously. I ran out to find the situation. Stepping out of the car was a girl with long hair, wearing a white dress that covered most of her legs. She didn't look at me, but was still bending down to get something from the car. I started to feel nervous. I asked her what help she needed. She said there was a problem with her car's brakes, causing her to almost have an accident, and she wanted me to check it for her. She stood up straight and looked at me, the face that I knew too well. She smiled and introduced herself as Hannah. I'm Isaac, 33 years old. I have a happy family with my wife Rachel, 29 years old, and our 5-year-old son named Jim. I have been living away from my family since I went to college, while Rachel has been an orphan since childhood. Our house is always filled with laughter from Jim's innocence, liveliness, and affection. Like other children, Jim has 2 imaginary friends named Anna and Julian. Jim always tells funny stories about him and his 2 friends for us to hear. Rachel doesn't like those stories and always creates opportunities for Jim to interact with real-life friends. Last summer, our family visited the orphanage where Rachel used to live as a child. I suggested to my wife that we stay at the orphanage for a few summer months so that both of us could rest and spend more time with Jim. Jim would have many friends to play with while my wife and I would assist the caregivers here. My wife was hesitant about this proposal. She thought about it for a long time and seemed unsure when I asked her again later on. Finally, Rachel agreed with the proposal. Jim was very happy to live here. He quickly made friends, which reassured us greatly. The principal arranged a private place for us that was clean and tidy. In the morning, while we were happily eating breakfast together, Jim introduced me and Rachel to his two new friends, Joey and Leon, whom he had just met recently. They would all become a group of 5 happy friends along with Anna and Julian. Although Jim had many other friends outside the orphanage now, but he couldn't forget his imaginary ones. Rachel was surprised when she heard Jim mention the names of his new friends again. She asked about the one named Leon once more. I was also surprised by her reaction, so I asked what was wrong. She laughed it off, saying it sounded like someone she once knew. One evening it got late, but I heard faint whispers from Jim's room. It surprised me because usually by this time every day, he would already be asleep, so I quickly went to check on him. When pushing open the door into his room, I saw Jim sitting there, staring at the wall in front of him, whispering, as if telling a fairy tale they used to read before bedtime. I gently called out his name. He turned around, smiling at me. He held my hands, introducing me to his newfound friend named Leon. I felt both confused and creeped out, as there was no one else in the room except for Jim and me. Jim told me to greet Leon politely because he was waving at me, pointing towards the wall in front of us and innocently saying so. Feeling a bit embarrassed, I followed his instructions. I asked Jim about Leon's appearance, and after thinking for a while, he replied, "I'm not sure, Dad. He is wearing a bag on his head. I can only see his blue eyes." Jim's innocence made me scared and worried. Was Jim really seeing someone that I couldn't see? Or could there be some mental issue with him? I comforted Jim to go to sleep and then returned to my room. The next day, Jim sat on the chair diligently drawing a picture. When he finished it, he happily ran back to show it to Rachel and me. The painting depicted 5 little friends standing side by side, holding hands happily. In the middle was a boy wearing a bag on his head. Before I could ask more about the painting, Rachel snatched it away forcefully with an angry expression on her face. She kept asking Jim where he met the strange boy with the bag on his head. What did that boy say? Jim cried out of fear, so I quickly snatched away my wife's hand and hugged our son tightly. I knew Rachel hated Jim's imaginary stories. After Rachel calmed down eventually, she gently apologized to Jim and embraced him lovingly. Her gentle approach made Jim feel more comfortable, and he began telling us. Jim said that he met that strange boy named Leon in art class at the orphanage. He sat alone at the last desk in class. He introduced himself as Leon. Leon said that he felt very lonely because nobody wanted to play with him. Jim wanted to take off Leon's bag so that he could see his face clearly, but Leon refused. Leon said that his face was very ugly, so he didn't want anyone to see it. I noticed Rachel slowly losing her composure through Jim's every word. She tightly gripped the boy's shoulders, staring into Jim's eyes with wide eyes, emphasizing each word. She demanded that Jim stop playing with Leon, effective now, and instructed him clearly not to believe anything that Leon said. Jim was frightened and started crying. I was uncomfortable with Rachel's baseless control so I took Jim away to calm her down. That evening, Rachel went to Jim's bedroom in an attempt to make things as happy and close as they used to be. On another occasion, during a happy family dinner, Jim seemed sad and ate less than usual. When questioned by Rachel, he looked up at me with teary eyes and said hesitantly, "I'm not your real son. I was brought from somewhere else." My wife and I were shocked. How could he know this? I comforted Jim, telling him it wasn't true, while Rachel assured him that whoever said it was lying. "Leon is a good friend. He would never lie to me," remarked Jim. Seeing Rachel getting angry at the mention of Leon's name, I quickly tried to soothe her and asked her to leave us alone. I was very stressed during that time. I understand that Jim is experiencing psychological changes and becoming increasingly curious about everything around him, while Rachel is losing her composure in raising her child. Jim was not our biological child. He was adopted from this very orphanage. However, no one except my wife and I knew that. We plan to disclose this to Jim when he is old enough. I'm really curious about Jim's new imaginary friend, Leon. In the following days, my wife and I spent more time with our son, caring for and encouraging him. Children tended to forget easily because Jim never mentioned it again after that. It's almost Jim's 6th birthday soon, and my wife and I were planning a celebration. We're organizing a grand party for Jim and inviting everyone from the orphanage to join us. On the day of the party, everything was perfect, except for the absence of Jim. I asked Rachel to go upstairs to call him down, while I stayed below to attend to our guests. She left, but took a long time to return. Looking at the clock, we were past due for the main part of the celebration. I quickly went upstairs to search for them both. As I reached their room, I heard Rachel calling out from inside the bathroom in distress. Hastily opening the door for her, I asked her what happened. She just urgently told me to find Jim quickly. Fear stretched on her face. I didn't understand what was happening, but at that moment, my main concern was my son. I searched everywhere, but couldn't find him. An overwhelming sense of dread began consuming me. When I encountered Rachel standing outside a storage shed, was staring into it in utter terror. I talked to Rachel about Jim's disappearance, and we immediately called the police. The birthday party was canceled. For 3 months, 2 of us worked with the police, but couldn't find Jim. I saw Rachel's despair because I knew how much she loved our son. I would hold Rachel tight every night as she cried herself to sleep. We have a few more days before we have to leave. Rachel hired a psychic. Rachel said she would do whatever it takes to find her son. Otherwise, she couldn't leave in peace. After performing the ritual, the psychic came to us. She looked at Rachel for a long time and said that Jim had died on his 6th birthday. My wife knows best where Jim was. I turned to look at Rachel. At that very moment, I truly suspected her having a hand on her son's demise. Rachel looked at me, then back to the psychic, with a panicked expression, and then she ran away very quickly. I chased after Rachel, but no matter how much I called, she wouldn't turn back. Rachel stood in front of the shed door, her eyes now filled with dread. Rachel trembled as she pushed aside all the items blocking the door and opened it. Inside the dark shed, a tiny figure lay on the floor, and the horrifying stench permeated through the air. I couldn't dare think further. My body was too stiff to move. Rachel ran to the decaying body, which was the boy wearing a cloth sack, just as Jim had described. But this cloth had a reddish-brown stain. Rachel removed the sack over, and Jim's disfigured face was revealed. she cried out in despair while I collapsed. Jim was determined to have died from severe trauma from head concussion and brain hemorrhage. After Jim's funeral, I confronted Rachel on what had happened on Jim's birthday. Before the party started, Jim repeatedly begged Rachel to invite Leon to his birthday. Rachel couldn't control her emotions and gave Jim a painful slap. Then she tearfully went downstairs to welcome the guests, leaving Jim alone. When Rachel went upstairs to call for Jim, she saw a boy with a cloth sack over his head standing there. As Rachel approached him, he forcefully pushed her into the bathroom and locked the door behind her. When I went up and opened the door for Rachel, she did not rush off to find Jim, but instead looked for that boy with a cloth sack over his head. Rachel saw a dark figure at the warehouse door. As she tried running towards it, the door suddenly slammed shut. Under such force, the furniture outside fell over, blocking it completely. Rachel kept thinking about that dark figure until I arrived. Rachel inadvertently contributed to Jim's death. I asked her about the one named Leon, when every time Jim mentioned about him, she acted very strange. She burst into tears, saying it was a thoughtless action back when she was in the orphanage. She used to pick on and isolate a kid named Leon because of his long scar across his face. She made him wear a cloth sack to cover his ugly face. One time, she and her cronies went overboard and accidentally suffocated Leon with it. I couldn't be able to look Rachel in the eyes after knowing all this. I love my wife very much, but can't forget all these cruel things she has done. Every time I see her, it reminds me of my pain from losing my son, Jim. I'm Dean. I'd got a wife and 2 young kids, a girl and a boy. We all lived happily in the peaceful, beautiful town of Tyringham, Massachusetts. We both agreed on limiting electronic devices when it came to raising our kids. We'd spend time playing and chatting with our kids. My favorite family game when we had free time was hide and seek. Looking for someone in a familiar space is exciting. It's also a bit thrilling and unpredictable. Usually we hid, and then the kids did the searching. I usually picked spots where I was pretty visible, like sticking out my arms or feet to give the kids a hint. Once they found me, I joined the kids in searching for my wife. Unlike me, Iris picked the most unexpected hiding spots. In the same space, she hid in the most unexpected places, under the sofa, in the kitchen cabinet, you name it. Every time we found her, the kids burst into laughter, and it made us really happy. But eventually, the game started to get a bit boring. The kids lost patience if they had to search for too long. My daughter even got upset and cried if she couldn't find us. So we decided to switch up the game a bit. One person hid, and the other 3 searched. I definitely knew where Iris is hiding, but I wouldn't give it away right away. I think I saw Mom hiding behind the kitchen cabinet, I told the kids, all excited. The kids giggled and dashed off to find their mom, but she was actually behind the shelf in the living room. To keep things interesting, we decided to stretch the game a bit for more suspense. One Saturday evening, after we all finished dinner, my son Terry said he wanted to play hide and seek, and everyone was totally on board. We decided that Iris would hide, and the rest of us would go looking for her. 1, 2, 3, 7, 10, 100. My daughter's sweet and not so serious counting made me and my wife crack up. We all heard my wife's joyful laughter, and I figured it was coming from the kitchen. Hey kids, let's check the living room for Mom first. They immediately ran off calling for their mom. I just stood there, feeling the kind of happiness any dad feels watching their kids have a blast. Emma quickly turned around and said Mom wasn't there. and Terry always echoed her. Okay, then you two check the bathroom. Mom, don't change your hiding spot, Emma said loudly, grabbed their little brother's hand, and they both ran into the bathroom. Dad, I still can't find Mom, my son ran back and said. I smiled and pointed to the kitchen. The kids got it, covered their mouths, laughed happily, and tiptoed over to the kitchen. I showed them where I knew my wife was hiding. Gotcha! The kids shouted with joy. I watched them and laughed out loud, but after a few seconds, their happy faces fell. She wasn't there. She must have sneaked off and changed her hiding spot. My wife could be so sneaky. I smiled and used a teasing voice to lift the kids' spirits again. Little detectives, go check the bedroom for Mom. I'm sure she's there. Hurry up, you two. The kids went along, but they weren't as excited anymore. I followed the kids upstairs and pushed the door open. We were all surprised when we didn't see my wife. At this point, the kids officially gave up on the game. They ran back to the living room and grabbed their toys to play. I walked around the house, calling out for her. Honey, we've lost. Just come out. My wife was more stubborn than I'd thought. She'd hidden in all sorts of tricky spots, but I still managed to find her. Did she find a new hiding spot? Honey, the kids aren't playing anymore. Come out. Then I heard a door bang in the basement. This time I was sure my wife was down there. I headed down the stairs to the basement. The dim light was even creepier than the darkness. I called her name loudly, but there was still no response. At this point, I started losing my patience. Iris, it's not fun anymore. The kids and I aren't into the game anymore. You should come out. It's almost bedtime for them. All I got in response was silence, the gloom, and a bit of the musty smell of the basement. The light bulb kept flickering and then went out, leaving me swallowed by darkness. Not able to see anything, I stood still for a few seconds and called out for Iris again. I was really scared of not being able to figure out where I was. Iris, please! I heard a rattling sound of light, so I called out for my wife quickly, feeling a bit annoyed. I'm heading upstairs. I'm done with this game. I turned around and walked straight ahead, groping in front of me to find the stairs. Something brushed past my hand, and I quickly pulled it back and froze. I called out for Iris, but this time with a slightly louder, more annoyed voice. As I turned back toward the basement, I saw something flash past me. I was sure it wasn't Iris. She's less than 5 feet tall. The person I saw had to be over 7 feet tall. I ran as fast as I could, with urgency and panic taking over. If I could just reach the steps, I could find my way up to the house. I tripped and fell, my whole body tumbling down the stairs, with the impact making me feel like my insides were screaming. I got up and crawled out of the basement. I rushed to the living room to find my kids. Emma! Terry! I screamed. What's wrong, honey? Iris and the kids looked at me blankly. Turns out, my wife was just sitting in the living room playing with them. Where have you been? I was hiding outside the house. You didn't expect that, did you? I immediately pulled my wife and the kids into the room, leaving them all confused. I locked the door, told Iris what had happened, and called the police. 10 minutes later, the police arrived. They searched the basement and the whole house, but found nothing unusual. I called someone to demolish the basement, even though Iris wasn't happy about it, and changed all the locks in the house. I still can't explain what I saw that day, but the feeling I got when someone brushed past my hand still makes me shiver. I just wanted to make sure my wife and kids were as safe as possible.
I'm Erica, 26 years old, living alone in Mississippi. I don't have many relatives. I've been living with my grandparents in Florida since I was young. I don't know who my father is, As for my mother, according to my grandparents, she was swept away and disappeared in a flood when I was 4 years old. After graduating from college, I moved to Mississippi to live and work. Mississippi is one of those states in the Gulf Coast region, heavily affected by hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. Every year, the government evacuates us to safer areas during disasters. The people here are accustomed to and quite experienced with this. Nevertheless, like everyone else living here, I love the land of Mississippi. 5 years ago, also during a relocation due to a natural disaster, the horrifying story happened, and now looking back, I still feel chills running down my spine. In February 2019, a serious flood occurred in the southern and central regions of Mississippi. There was a significant amount of rainfall, causing millions of dollars in damage and displacing over 15,000 people. My neighbors and I were among them. We were moved to an elementary school where there should be enough sleeping space for the overwhelming number of people. Upon arriving at the temporary shelter area, I called my grandparents to reassure them. We were informed that we would be here for about a week to ensure the flood would subside completely. We were no strangers to relocations like this anymore. People adapted quite easily and quickly. Each person would be provided with personal items, necessary food, and a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was the horrifying nightmare for me after that relocation. Until now, I'm afraid of all the big zipper-locking bags. After dinner and personal hygiene, we went to the classrooms to rest. I remember each classroom could accommodate a maximum of 20 people. I found a suitable spot for myself and lay down. I usually read before going to sleep. Luckily, I managed to bring the book I was reading before the relocation. Lying down reading for a while, I noticed a strange woman in the room. She was quite small, with disheveled clothes and a panicked look on her face. She kept pacing around the room, mumbling incessantly, clutching the sleeping bag tightly. I didn't pay much attention to her, continuing to read my book. After a while, when everyone had fallen asleep, I looked at my phone. It was almost midnight. I also marked my page and prepared to go to sleep. Just as I closed my eyes, I heard murmurs from someone. Despite trying to ignore it, it was very clear and close to me. I pulled the sleeping bag down and turned around. My heart seemed to stop for a few seconds. Right in front of me was the face of that woman. She had wide open eyes, staring at me and sporting a sinister smile. Her breath smelled terribly, like a corpse. Reflexively, I sat up, yelled loudly while moving back. Some people who hadn't fallen asleep heard my loud scream and immediately got up to check the situation. The room lights were turned on, and the neighbor asked me what had happened. Terrified, I pointed towards the woman, saying she was very creepy and smelled awful. But looking back, lying asleep in the sleeping bag was an old lady. I stared at her in amazement. While everyone threw me at their annoying glances, everyone returned to their place, turned off the lights, and went to sleep. I moved to another corner of the room, pulled the sleeping bag high, leaving only a small hole for air to enter. My heart still hadn't returned to normal beats. After a while, still unable to sleep, I gently pulled the sleeping bag down and looked outside. The woman was lying there, looking at me, but her head was completely turned upside down compared to her body. I tightly shut my mouth, trying not to make any loud noises. I pulled the zipper off the sleeping bag to cover my body completely, trying to regulate my breathing. I closed my eyes, put on my headphones, and fell asleep without knowing when. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing I did was look around the room. The woman had disappeared. About 4 days later, everything went on as usual. I never met that woman again. People in the shelter didn't care or remember anything about her. We were all happy when the government announced that the flood had completely receded. After today, we can safely return home and resume our normal lives. That night, I don't remember how long I slept. A foul smell hit my nose, causing me to wake up in a daze. That terrible smell made me wake up immediately. I sat up, looked around. Everyone was still sleeping. Turning to the left, I saw someone lying next to me, the sleeping bag covering the entire body. My neighbor Maria was lying on the right. I shook her awake. I asked her if she smelled anything unpleasant. Maria sniffed, looked around, then said she didn't smell anything and went back to sleep. But the smell of decay was very clear. Why didn't anyone else smell it? The next morning I woke up. That foul smell was still there. It made me extremely dizzy and nauseous. Everyone was quickly packing up to go home. The person in the sleeping bag next to me still hadn't woken up. I was surprised, reached out to wake that person up. As soon as I touched the sleeping bag, a loud noise rang out, making me startle. I called out loudly a few more times, but the person inside the sleeping bag still didn't respond. I trembled, reached out to pull the zipper of the bag down. Inside the sleeping bag was a rotting corpse. I immediately screamed loudly and jumped out of control. People around came to help me calm down. I was crying and trembling, trying to tell them about the terrifying thing inside the sleeping bag. Once again, the incomprehensible looks were staring at me. A man came over, picked up the sleeping bag. A few snacks and a bottle fell out from inside. He looked at me uncomfortably, saying it was his sleeping bag and I should stop making such a fuss. I was panicked. Finally, what was going on? Why was I the only one seeing those terrifying things? On the way home, I heard the radio on the bus recounting the case of a woman. Her name was Luisa. 22 years ago, when she was 27 years old, she was a single mother who was swept away by the flood while going to pick up her 4-year-old daughter from school. Luisa's body was never found. I was stunned. My whole body was freezing cold. I remembered the horrific image of that woman. She had eyes very similar to my mother's.
I'm Natalie, living in Queens, New York. I've been orphaned since childhood, living with my grandmother and aunt. They're the only family I've known. Since elementary school, I've been close friends with Laura, who lives just a block away from me. Laura has a similar background to mine. Her father abandoned her and her mother when Laura was 4. By the time she was 10, her mother left Laura with her grandparents and remarried. Laura and I grew up together, considering each other as sisters. I have a strong personality, while Laura is very feminine. Both of us lacking affection, we deeply cherish and support each other. When we went to college, Laura and I decided to attend the same university. By sophomore year, Laura met a guy named Kane. Kane is 2 years older than us, with a somewhat eccentric appearance. He's tall and very skinny. His pale and white skin made him look frail and delicate. His brown hair always hung long and somewhat disheveled. Kane had multiple piercings on his ears, nose, lips, chin, and eyebrows. Living alone, he never mentioned or met any of his relatives. Kane and Laura quickly fell in love after just 1 month of knowing each other. When Laura told me she had accepted Kane's confession of love, I was genuinely surprised and somewhat disappointed. I didn't like Kane. For some reason, I just didn't feel fond of him. Many times, I caught his eerie and intimidating gaze towards Laura, but I had no right to interfere in her personal life. Laura's grandmother also advised her several times to be careful and vigilant with Kane. After 3 months of dating, Laura and Kane announced their engagement, shocking everyone. Laura was so deeply in love with Kane that she brushed off the warnings. They moved to the house Kane had rented previously in the neighboring town after getting married. Laura missed out on her studies, choosing to stay home and do household chores. At first, she would often come back to visit. We went out together, and Laura would talk about married life with Kane with an extremely happy face. Seeing Laura happy, I gradually started to trust her decision. But Laura's visits gradually became less frequent. Her messages and calls to me also decreased. Even when I sent her messages for days, Laura would only reply briefly. The happy photos Laura shared with her husband on her personal account slowly turned into posts filled with hidden emotions. Once when I visited Laura, she looked visibly thinner. She led me into the house and I greeted Kane cheerfully. He responded with an extremely cold tone, not even looking at me. Kane looked at Laura with a threatening gaze. He said he had to go out for something and would be back in the afternoon. As soon as Kane left, Laura burst into tears when I asked how she was doing. She cried a lot for a long time. I hugged Laura, trying to comfort her. Although Laura didn't share anything, I knew she wasn't happy. In the following weeks, Laura kept posting images of herself on her social media. In these photos, Laura's facial features appeared familiar yet strangely different. Her eyes seemed soulless, gazing into an undefined space. What stood out was that all the photos had the same expression, no longer radiating the bright and innocent smile as before. Through these images, I noticed Laura become increasingly unfamiliar. I also noticed that the tattoo on her neck had disappeared. I wondered if that was really Laura. One evening, around 11 o'clock, I received a phone call. "Natalie, I'm scared. I just had a dream about Laura. She said she was having trouble breathing. Her face was distorted, limbs broken. I couldn't reach Laura anymore." Laura's grandmother cried and begged me to find Laura. I immediately tried to contact her, but also couldn't reach her. With a sense that something terrible had happened, I immediately reported to the local police in the town where Laura and Kane lived. When the police arrived at the house, both Laura and Kane were missing. The house was empty, devoid of any belongings. In the bedroom, they found a sex doll sitting on the bed. It looked exactly like Laura. The doll was still very new and appeared to have been cleaned before being left behind. The house was clean too, with no signs or personal belongings left behind. Through the street security cameras, the police couldn't find any trace of Laura and Kane for the past 10 days. They had vanished. Upon closer inspection of the images Laura had posted before disappearing, it wasn't Laura, but the doll that had been found. Where had they gone? The doll was sent back to Laura's grandmother by the police. She cried a lot. The doll seemed to remind her even more of Laura. Nearly a year passed, but news about Laura and Kane remained a mystery. I often visited Laura's grandmother. She cherished the doll and placed it in Laura's former bedroom, as if Laura still existed in this house. Looking at the doll, I truly wondered, what was its purpose? Why did everything in Laura's house disappear except for it? Suddenly, I noticed a part of the doll's arm seemed to be sticking out. There was something sharp inside, about to puncture the outer layer of the doll's skin. Laura's grandmother and I decided to cut open the doll's arm to see what was inside. As the knife sliced through, the doll's arm split open along a long seam. From within, a decaying human hand emerged along with the slimy silicone material. The smell of plastic and decay filled the air heavily. Laura's grandmother was in shock, clutching her chest and screaming before collapsing. I led her out of the living room and locked Laura's room, then called the police. After examination, the police determined that the body inside the sex doll was Laura's. The cause of Laura's death could not be determined. No words can describe the panic, and panic of Laura's grandmother at that moment. For the past 8 years, Kane has been on the run, with warrants issued throughout the United States and some neighboring countries. But they have never found any leads. Even his personal information is not on the national magazine. I always remember Laura, my sweet and warm-hearted girl. I'm Jacob. I live in Baldwin Park, California. That night, I and my 2 friends, Roy and Ethan, went to the KFC store in the city to have dinner. At the end of the meal, we didn't want to leave yet, so I invited 2 of my friends to play Truth or Dare. Ethan and I spun to truths and told the secret about the girl we were paying attention to. When it was Roy's turn, he turned to dare. I excitedly stood up and challenged Roy to go out of the store and perform a spell to call out to the devil. Roy is very superstitious of the supernatural beings, so he immediately refused. But Ethan and I were determined not to let Roy go. I tried to force Roy, and in the end he had no other choice but to comply. It was nearly 12 o'clock at night, and there were only us and 3 employees left in the restaurant. Looking through the window, his frightened and trembling appearance made Ethan and I burst out laughing. Ethan and I told each other that this would be an experience for Roy to become braver. But when we looked back through the window, we couldn't see Roy anymore. I told Ethan, "In a few seconds, he will scream loudly and rush in here." But 5 minutes later, Roy still hasn't appeared. Ethan said that Roy was probably trying to lure me and Ethan out there and scare us to startle us. Ethan and I happily held back our laughter and went out. We decided to ruin Roy's joke. But walking around the store, still couldn't find Roy. I looked for him in the parking lot, and Ethan ran into the store's restroom to search, but Roy was still nowhere to be found. I called Roy's phone. The other end picked up, but there was a very long silence. I turned off the phone, feeling annoyed with Roy's prank. I pulled Ethan home, ignoring Roy. At that time, I selfishly only thought about my own feelings without thinking about Roy's fear of being forced to do something he was so afraid of. I got home at 2 a.m. and went to sleep. The next morning, Ethan and I went to Roy's house. His sister opened the door and said that Roy didn't come home last night. She called many times, but Roy's phone said he couldn't be reached. Ethan and I looked at each other in surprise. I immediately took the phone and called Roy, and the other end picked up. We happily stared at our phones. I quickly asked where Roy was. He didn't answer. I called Roy many times, but the response was still silence. Feeling that this was serious, my sister Roy and I decided to report it to the police. Police reviewed security cameras at the KFC Baldwin Park store. The image on the camera recorded, after performing the demon summoning spell, Roy headed towards the store's parking lot. But when taking image data from the parking lot camera, Roy was nowhere to be seen. Only saw a red shadow passing by, while Roy was wearing blue clothes. Continue investigating Roy's disappearance. The police said I should call him so they can trace his location via the phone signal. Once again, this option failed when the police signal tracking system failed to pinpoint his exact position. Where did he end up? That's the question that's always on my mind. It's been a week since Roy went missing, and all police search efforts have come to a dead end. I'm really confused and regretful. I wish I hadn't thought of that stupid game. One evening, I was having a meal in the kitchen when I accidentally looked out the window and suddenly saw Roy. Roy smiled when he knew I saw him. I stood up and called out happily. Roy smiled devilishly with 2 sharp fangs and bloodshot eyes. I was stunned for a few seconds. Looking closely again, Roy returned to his normal state. Rushed out, but Roy had disappeared. Maybe I was wrong. I've been thinking too much about Roy these past few days. It was around 12 o'clock that night that I went to bed. When I was about to lie down, I saw Roy again outside the window with a devilish smile. I was so scared. How could he be there? My room was on the 3rd floor. Getting out of bed, walking towards the window, I slowly put my hand on the handle and opened the window. But there was no one there, just the dark and quiet space of the night. Suddenly, a loud, terrifying laugh rang out, and I turned around in surprise. Immediately, Roy, with wide eyes, wide mouth, bearing 2 sharp fangs, rushed to push me down. I lay in a pool of my own blood, looked up and saw Roy's face gradually turning into Satan's. Roy looked at me and laughed loudly. I screamed loudly and jumped up. The terrible dream I had just made my head hurt. My heart beat so hard it was hard to breathe. Quickly looked towards the window. It had been open for some time. I quickly rushed to close the window and close the curtains. The next morning, my body felt like it was drained of all its strength. Lying in bed, I called Ethan. I wanted to tell him about last night's dream. Ethan's mother answered the phone. She was sobbing, her voice distorted. Ethan crashed through the window from the 13th floor of his apartment last night. He was lying in a pool of blood with his body in pieces. I was dumbfounded by what I just heard. I turned around to look at the window. The curtains had been pulled open. On the glass window was printed the left hand with the index finger and little finger pointing up, while the remaining fingers were bent down. I'm Hal, 37, and I run a Taco Bell right on a busy street downtown. The place gets a ton of love, so I'm basically working around the clock. One night, around 10:30, I was about to shut down after a long 16-hour grind. Out of nowhere, a couple walked in looking all unsure. The guy went, "Hi, sorry, but can you hook us up with whatever food you've got left?" I was kind of confused, so I didn't reply right away. "We come from way far away, and your place is the only one open." So I was like, "Just hang on a sec." And I couldn't say no since they were customers, you know? It took me like 10 minutes to whip up 2 burritos, even though I didn't have all the ingredients. The couple was super grateful and dug into their food, and watching them enjoy it made me feel way less tired. I was just wandering around cleaning the cashier counter for a bit, and when I turned around, the woman was still munching while the guy was staring at me. I asked, kind of worried, "Is there something wrong with the food, man?" He smiled a bit and said, "Oh no, it's awesome." Usually when I get compliments like that from customers, I'm super happy. But the way the guy looked at me and smiled just gave me the creeps. The guy asked me, "Are you the owner of this place?" "Yes." "Great. Do you live by yourself?" I was like, "Yeah, I live just a few minutes away." I have no idea why I blurted that out without thinking or being careful. The guy got up, threw some cash on the table, and walked out, and the woman quickly jumped up and followed him. I didn't think much of it, just headed home to crash since my body was totally telling me to chill out. As I walked out of the bathroom all wet, I heard loud banging on the door and a woman's weak voice.
"Help me, please."
I froze for a few seconds before bolting to the door, while the woman kept banging and begging.
Please help
I peeked through the peephole, and it was a woman in messed up clothes with crazy hair and a bunch of bruises all over her. I didn't open the door, but I asked, "What's wrong?" just to be safe.
Let me in, please. He's about to catch up with me.
I got even more on edge and said, "I'm calling the police right now, just chill out."
No, please don't call the police. Just let me in, please.
The woman got more and more freaked out, and her voice along with the banging on the door got faster. and way more urgent. When I looked closer at the woman's face, I was shocked. It kind of felt like she was with that guy from earlier. For a few seconds, I caught a glimpse of anger in her eyes. I quickly grabbed my phone and said, "There's a woman in front of my house who needs..." The woman yelled,
Don't call the cops.
and punched the door. I jumped back a bit, and the phone I was holding dropped. A few seconds later, along with the woman's wild scream for help, I heard another guy screaming,
You're dead already, damn it.
Open the door quick. I'm begging you.
and then just like that, those scary sounds faded away. I hurried to the door and peeked through the peephole, but the woman was gone, and the guy was nowhere to be seen either. The sudden switch totally threw me off. I gripped the doorknob, caught between being scared and curious. There was an axe blade stuck in the door, like just a few millimeters from my forehead. I froze, and my heart felt like it stopped. The axe blade got pulled out, leaving a hole in the door, and this wild-eyed man said,
I want to taste your blood.
The next few axe hits were super hard on the door. The door was totally wrecked, and I was hiding in the kitchen cabinet, trying to hold my breath. They were coming in, the crazy, mean-looking guy and the woman. Just a little more, I muttered as the guy got close enough. About 10 minutes later, I was fine and sitting in the living room making a call. In front of me was the guy with a bullet deep in his shoulder, bleeding like crazy, and the woman crying and begging. "Hey, I've got 2 fresh orders here. One for organs and the other, let's see, for entertainment." So, I ended up with a big chunk of money, enough to expand the shop and get the door fixed with the latest high-tech lock. "Mommy, can a child live in a trash can?" That was an innocent question from my son, but it haunted me ever since I learned the story of a monstrous mother. I am a single mother, living with my 5-year-old son in a small neighborhood. Everyone here is very friendly, except for the house right next to mine. I found out that the owner of that house is also a single mother named Hebe, with 5 young children, 4 daughters and a youngest son, who is the same age as my son. She was described by the neighbors as someone with a selfish lifestyle. I met her a few times, but my greetings were ignored and met with a very cold attitude. Several times, loud arguments could be heard coming from Hebe's house at night between her and another man. I guessed that he was the father of one of her 5 children, as they did not resemble each other. One day, I was busy preparing dinner in the kitchen and left my son to play alone in the living room. A moment later, the boy ran over and hugged my leg, saying, "Mommy." I replied to my son while still focusing on cooking, "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Mom, can a child live in a trash can?" My son's innocent question made me laugh. If there are a lot of ugly bacteria, why would you want to live in there? "I don't want to, but the boy next door does." "Then you should advise your friend not to do that." I brushed off my son's question and quickly finished making dinner. After dinner, I worked while my son watched TV. When I glanced at my son, I was a bit surprised to see him watching images of trash cans. "Honey, what are you watching?" The boy didn't respond. His face was very pensive, and his eyes were fixed on the TV screen. "Are you trying to learn about something? Being inside there must be really cramped. And there are no candles, toys, or even a TV, Mom." My son's voice was very sad. "Who are you talking about?" "It is about the friend from next door." "There's no way that would happen, Mikey. Every baby deserves to be loved." I smiled, knowing my little boy had grown and had the sensitivity of a 5-year-old. I took my son to his room, kissed him goodnight, and then returned to my own room. I didn't go to sleep right away. I finished up some work first. About 10 minutes later, my son cried out loudly in a panic. I didn't have time to react before the boy opened the door, ran to me, and hugged me tightly while crying a lot. "Mom, please save him. He'll be hungry in the trash can." I look at my son in shock. I didn't rush to ask my son questions. Instead, I comforted him first. Once my son calmed down, he recounted everything that had happened. From losing his ball in the neighbor's backyard, he had planned to run in quickly and come back since no one was around. "I picked up a plastic bottle in the yard and threw it in the trash can, just as you told me. I saw him in the trash can." Hearing my son's story left me in shock and made me shudder. I immediately called the police because I was sure my son wasn't lying. From the information I gathered, the police had to visit Hebe's house 3 times before uncovering the horrifying truth. She denied having a son, constantly crying and pretending to be pitiful. In the shed in Hebe's backyard, the police found a trash can containing the body of her youngest son. Hebe took advantage of her sad circumstances to register for government assistance using her son's information. Hebe's children were very unfortunate as they received no care or attention from their own mother. Her youngest son died from a high fever that led to seizures and brain damage. After learning of her son's death, she didn't obtain a death certificate or bury him properly, and she didn't seem to grieve at all. Her selfishness and greed were even more disgusting as Hebe continued to use her son's information to receive monthly benefits. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but her cold-bloodedness and insensitivity deserved to be locked up forever. It was heartbreaking for the little boy. That innocent soul deserved protection and love instead of being abandoned like that. How could a mother not love her own child? Did she really deserve to be called mom by her 5 children? This story is based on a true event that occurred in Rock Island, Illinois on July 25th, 2023. The police received the tip-off from a neighbor who claimed that the woman next door was hiding the long-dead body of her son in her home. It took a long time for the police to uncover the truth about a selfish, irresponsible mother and her unfortunate little boy. I'm Xavier, 21 years old. I'm a waiter in a luxury restaurant downtown. The restaurant is still in the works, so it's super busy right now. Some days I end up working late into the night, and man, my body feels beat. But hey, the pay is really good in return. I live with my dad in this old house at the end of the street. Every day, it's like an hour on the bus to get to work and back. My next goal is to afford a car so I can get around easier. One evening, after wrapping up work at 10:30 p.m., I rushed to the station to catch the last bus home. Because I've been so tired and not sleeping well for days, I passed out as soon as I hopped on the bus for 5 minutes. Luckily, I woke up just as the bus was pulling up near my house. I hustled home and crashed right into bed. The next morning when I woke up, out of habit, I reached for my phone first thing. But when I searched under my pillow and around my bed, my phone was nowhere to be found. I sat up, all groggy-faced from sleep, and dug through my backpack only to realize my phone was missing. Digging through my hazy memories of yesterday, I figured my phone must have fallen on the bus. After showering, I went downstairs and told my dad what happened. I borrowed my dad's phone and called my number. After a few rings, someone answered. A girl named Lisa. a high school student, answered on the other end of the line. Lisa found my phone on the bus. She promised to give it back and said she'd meet at a cafe near her school at 9 p.m. that night. Luckily, a nice girl found my phone. I took my dad's phone to work that day. In the evening, I asked to leave work early at the restaurant so I could go to the cafe. Just as I was almost there, a weird message popped up on my dad's phone. "Hey, it's Lisa. Your phone busted, so I took it to get it fixed. I'm in urgent. I'll leave first." Lisa texted me the repair shop's address, which was close to the cafe. I walked in, and there was just one guy working there. He had on a hat and a mask, and he wasn't very friendly. He told me my phone screen was broken, and he fixed it. I powered up my phone to check it out and make sure everything was cool. When I asked about the repair cost, the guy at the store said Lisa had already taken care of it. On the way home, I tried calling the number Lisa texted earlier to thank her, but it turned out the number didn't exist. I told my dad everything. He's super careful, so he started asking all these questions about Lisa. First off, Lisa found my phone on the bus around 11:30 p.m. Why was this high school kid out so late? Next thing, the phone was busted, but she was still picking up when I called this morning. And lastly, how does a student have enough money to cover phone repair bills? I didn't stress it and went back to my room. I tried calling Lisa's number again, but still couldn't get through. If I get to see her again, I'll definitely thank her. When I opened my phone, I found 3 pics of a dark room. Maybe Lisa or someone at the phone repair shop took those pics, so I deleted them. Also, the browser history had some really weird sites I'd never seen before. Other than that, the phone still works fine. The next day, I finished my work and was about to change clothes and head out. The restaurant manager called me over and said a customer wanted me to wait on their table. He said he's a regular here, goes by Owen. I'd been here a while, knew all the regulars, and I'd never seen him before. But actually, he looked and sounded really familiar. The dishes Owen asked for are usually only for VIPs here at the restaurant. After that, everything went as usual, and Owen left after dinner. He slipped me a little tip, too. The next morning, I freaked out seeing 80 missed calls from the restaurant manager. I woke up to hundreds of messages from coworkers, all blaming and cursing me. I posted an article on my personal website calling out a restaurant for using toxic ingredients. I even texted the manager, griping about the strict work style and low pay. I kept going and started dropping F-bombs on my colleagues. If they could have reached through the phone screen, they would have torn my scalp off. But seriously, I didn't do any of that crazy stuff. Why do I have to make myself look bad to everyone? I got fired from my job, and the restaurant was in bad shape too. The manager said he'd sue me for trashing the restaurant's reputation. I was totally crushed and just bawled my eyes out with my bestie Rose at the cafe, not ruling out the chance that my account got hacked. Some guy came up to me, acting like he knew me, which totally threw Rose and me off. When he said he was Owen, a regular at the restaurant, it clicked. I wasn't really in the mood, so I just gave him a quick answer and thanked him for being nice. But during our chat, he somehow got Rose's name right without her even saying a word since we met. Owen was pretty baffled. He mentioned he'd been sitting at the back table for a while and accidentally caught some of our chat. But when Rose gave him in the side eye and started drilling him with questions, he bailed right away. Rose warned me to watch out because nowadays, people can have some messed up ideas. At night, I couldn't sleep because some ex-coworkers were blowing up my phone with hate texts. Feeling mentally wrecked, I grabbed my phone to shut it down, but I froze. My phone was sending nasty texts to my ex-colleagues all by itself. I logged out and shut down the social media app, but then the phone just logged itself back in. No matter how many times I try, it's pointless. What's even wilder is the phone suddenly opened the camera and snapped my freaked out face. I just yelled and chucked the phone on the floor in frustration. A moment later, I heard my dad calling from outside the door.
What's going on?
I hurried to open the door, crying, and spilled everything to my dad about what happened. He comforted me. A little later, while I was still in my room bawling, my dad brought Rose over and she gave me a hug. Dad stood at the door, staring at me with concern for a while, then walked off. The next day, when I was calmer, Rose and I spent the whole day watching the phone, recording all the weird stuff it was doing. I took the evidence to the cops, and it took the FBI a day to nail the guy behind it, Owen. When I confronted him at the police station, I tried to keep my cool. The FBI caught a bunch of phones from his place that were linked directly to victims like me. They also found notebooks that had all their activities, habits, and even their private pics recorded. Turns out, there wasn't any high school girl named Lisa. Owen was using some app to fake his voice. Owen got sentenced with a 5-year sentence and had to pay back all the folks he messed with. I got back to work and learned a valuable lesson from it. I'm Melvin, and I'm 17. I've lived with my grandparents and Aunt Sam since I was little, and I've never met my parents. I've always felt loved by my grandmother and Aunt Sam, but not by my grandfather. I feel like there's always been a gap between me and my grandfather that just can't be closed. He's never really shown me any words of care or loving gestures. When I was 10, I used to run home from the bus stop all excited. The sound of kids crying left me feeling really confused. When I walked into the living room, I saw my grandmother holding a baby wrapped in a blanket, and she was crying too. "Come here, Melvin. This is your little brother, Henry." I was really curious. As a 10-year-old, I had a lot of questions, like why I suddenly had a younger brother, and whether he was born by our mother, Carrie.
You're not allowed to ask questions that go against any instructions from adults.
My grandfather's voice sounded really annoyed when he heard my questions. Aunt Sam quickly pulled me over to see my brother, but I was in tears because I felt sorry for myself and didn't really feel anything for Henry. I stayed in the room that my grandmother said was my mom's room, and Henry stayed with my grandparents since he was too young. I asked my grandmother about my parents many times, but she just smiled with a red, tearful face. My grandmother always told me to keep the room just as it was, down to the smallest details. The picture showed a very young and beautiful woman, and my grandmother said that that was my mother, Carrie. I don't have any information about my father, and neither do my grandparents. I don't share many traits with my mother, but resemble my grandfather more, and I really don't like that. I've had insomnia since I was a kid, probably around 7 or 8 years old, because of all the different noises. Sometimes it was the laughter of kids, and other times it was the crying and scolding. I could never quite pinpoint where it was coming from. I told my grandmother everything because she always listened to me.
Stop making up stories and asking for things.
My grandfather's voice sounded annoyed when he overheard me telling my grandmother that the room needed better soundproofing. My grandmother didn't have much of a say in the house because she didn't work. The whole family relied on my grandfather's salary for all the expenses. I saw my grandfather get angry with her many times. even throwing away the dinner she had just made because she mentioned my mother. She wanted him to spend some money to hire a detective to find my mother, Carrie. My grandfather didn't seem to care about my mother, so I could kind of understand why he didn't show much love for my siblings and me. Because I was really afraid of my grandfather and didn't want to cause any trouble for my grandmother, I tried to put up with those noises for many years. Sometimes, hearing the laughter of the kids made me laugh too. I also have a younger brother, Henry, but we always had to follow my grandfather's strict rules, so we were all pretty closed off. As I grew up, I always planned to visit my mother and ask her why she didn't bring my brothers and me along, or why she never came to visit us. One day, the family dinner took a serious turn when my grandfather announced that he was at risk of losing his job. At night, I heard the two adults arguing about money and some illness, along with the sound of a child crying. I put a pillow over my ears, but I couldn't block out the annoying noise. It sounds like it's Grandpa. I sat up and walked around the room, trying to find a spot where I could hear the noise as clearly as possible. The woman's scream was really loud, and then the argument stopped. I had a lot of doubt about the man's voice. For almost a week now, the noise I've been hearing every night is a mix of a child crying and a woman's soothing voice. Of course I can't sleep. The child's crying might mean they're uncomfortable or sick. I know this from seeing my grandmother take care of Henry when he was little. She gently held Henry, comforted him, and sang him a lullaby with a worried and tired expression. A noise that sounded like a door opening came from right outside. I quietly went to open the door, and it was my grandfather. He must be thirsty. I figured that since there was a bathroom in my grandparents' bedroom, he wouldn't use the one in the living room. I followed him down to the living room, and instead of turning right to go to the kitchen, my grandfather turned left. I kept a safe distance so he wouldn't notice me and kept following him. My grandfather went into the basement. I waited until he was inside, then I hurriedly followed him. But by the time I got to the basement, my grandfather had disappeared. I walked around looking for him but couldn't find him, and I started wondering if I was dreaming. I decided to sit in a hidden corner and wait, and eventually I fell asleep. The sound like a lock made me jump awake. I was surprised when my grandfather appeared out of nowhere and left the basement. I didn't tell my grandmother, but decided to keep an eye on my grandfather for a few more days. For the next 3 days, my grandfather didn't do anything out of the ordinary and didn't go to the basement again. I was tormented by the sound of a little girl crying and the woman's constant cursing. In her scolding and cursing, she mentioned Mark, my grandfather. I grew more and more curious about my grandfather and was sure he was hiding some kind of secret. On the 4th night, I saw my grandpa pulling back a shelf in the basement, and it opened up to another basement behind it. While I was still in shock, my grandpa led a woman holding a little girl, and they both ran out of the basement in a hurry. The woman's face looked a lot like my mom's. I didn't really react, and I'm not sure what I was feeling at that moment. I just stayed in that corner of the basement until the next morning. The police, along with my grandparents, Aunt Sam, and the woman who looked like my mom, came back. With the police urging him on, my grandpa reopened the door to the other basement. 4 more people came out one by one, all calling the woman Mom and my grandpa Dad. My grandmother immediately collapsed and gasped. I ran over to hug her, and everyone was surprised. The strange woman looked at me, burst into tears, and called my name, The whole truth about my parents, the two people I had been longing to see for 17 years, was finally revealed. The noises I heard every night were from my mom and my siblings, who had been living in a dark, cramped basement. My mom had been imprisoned for 24 years by her own father, someone I didn't know whether to call dad or grandpa. I had 7 siblings in total. It should have been 8, but one of them died because my mom was abused while she was 7 months pregnant. My grandfather took Henry and me upstairs because the basement was too cramped and told us that my mom had abandoned us. I can't forgive the person who committed this terrible crime, but he did create my 7 siblings. Mother Carrie endured extreme physical and mental pain. Even though she hated the person who took away her future and happiness, she always said that she loved and protected all of us at all costs. I love my mom and my other siblings a lot, for I'm the lucky one. I've decided to move on and live a new, happy life with my grandmother, Mother Carrie, Aunt Sam, and my 6 siblings. But I never stopped wondering why my grandfather did such horrible things to his own daughter. The story is based on a real-life event about the tragic life of a girl named Elizabeth Fritzl. Her real dad is Joseph Fritzl, a messed up, creepy guy. He started abusing his daughter Elizabeth when she was just 11. When Elizabeth was growing up, she tried to run away from her monster of a dad a bunch of times, but it never worked. For 7 years, starting when Elizabeth was 11, Joseph started working on turning the basement into a prison. On August 28, 1984, when Elizabeth was only 18, he drugged her and locked her up in the dark basement. He raped her every day, and after 24 years, Elizabeth had 7 kids with him, going through unimaginable pain and humiliation. In April 2008, Joseph finally let his oldest daughter, Kristen, who was really sick, go to the hospital. From there, the truth came out, and the whole world saw the face of a monster. I'm Isaac, 40 years old, and I have a small family with my wife and our 5-year-old son, David. We were married for almost 10 years before we had David. David hasn't been as lucky as other kids. His brain development is slower than what's typical for his age. We still love and cherish him, and we want to give him the best we can. But ever since we had David, we have had a lot of tense arguments about how to raise him. My wife always wants everything to be systematic and scientific, while I prefer our child to develop more naturally. A lot of times, our discussions have turned into arguments, even right in front of David. One time, my wife and I got into such a heated argument that we ended up breaking some stuff around the house because I just couldn't calm down. David was standing near the dining table, trembling and crying because he was so scared. My wife covered her ears, screaming and crying. I figured the best way to handle it was to grab David and just leave the house. I drove him to the playground at the park, which was a few miles away. Sitting in the car, the boy kept crying and looked at me with a scared expression. I don't even remember how I drove to the park. Everything was so blurry. When we got to the playground, I tried to cheer him up by laughing and joking around to help David feel more at ease. After a bit, David started laughing too, and we played on the slide together. David ran through the colorful plastic tubes and slid down, and I chased after him, pretending to be the boogeyman to make the game more exciting. David was freaking out because the boogeyman was chasing him, so he quickly sat down, ready to slide down. I stood at the bottom of the slide to catch my son, but David never came down. I called out for David and started searching every corner. My mind was racing, and I didn't even know how much time had passed. But I was so exhausted that I just collapsed next to the slide. I woke up in the hospital with a doctor, a nurse, and some police officers there. Once I remembered everything, I quickly reported it to the police to get help. My son got taken near the slide. Please help me find him. Mr. Isaac, we need you to come to the police station to help us with the investigation into your son's disappearance. You're the main suspect in this case. I was stunned and tried to explain, saying I needed to see my wife because she must be really worried since neither of us came home all night. We need to keep you two apart for safety reasons. Once we sort this out, if you're not the one responsible, we'll let you go home. What the hell are you talking about? I need to stress again that my son is missing, and I really need to see my wife. A policeman came over to restrain and handcuff me, while the other one talked to the doctor. After the doctor gave a nod, 2 policemen walked me out. I was still feeling dizzy, so I got off the bed and just collapsed right away. The 2 police officers were even rougher with me. When I got to the police station, they gave me some kind of drink and told me to wait for 15 minutes before the interrogation started. My head was spinning, and my memories kept coming and going in a really confusing way. After 15 minutes, I was feeling more awake, and the police came in with a stack of photos. As I looked at each photo, my emotions just intensified. The first photo showed my car parked in the park, and the front of it was pretty badly dented and scratched. Next were some photos of the slide at the playground. Finally, there was a photo of me, covered in dirt and blood. What is this? Are you sober now, Isaac? I stared at the police in shock, then looked back at the photos. I grabbed the bottle of water I had just drunk, realizing it was a hangover cure. I held my head, trying to piece everything together. It turned out I had always been a terrible husband and an irresponsible father. I used alcohol to deal with stress and to justify my failed and miserable career. I constantly pressured my wife to have kids. When my wife gave birth to David, I didn't care about him at all. I was always half sober and half drunk, which scared and pushed him away. That night, I just couldn't control my wild behavior. Because of the weird prank and me looking like a real boogeyman, David panicked, slipped, and fell from the slide to the ground, and I hid David in the bushes, about a mile away from the playground. On the day I faced my wife in court, I couldn't bring myself to look at her, even for a second. We settled both the divorce and David's case at the same time. I lost everything and paid for my selfishness and carelessness with a 20-year prison sentence. I'm Victor. I'm 27, and I work as an IT engineer. I make a pretty decent living. I've got a girlfriend who usually comes over to my place on the weekends and stays the night. My apartment's in a small building that's not super modern, but the rent is pretty reasonable. I could afford to move to a nicer place, but I'm fine with where I'm at. My neighbors are pretty friendly. Basically, we just say hello when we see each other, maybe lend a few small household items and keep to ourselves. That's all I need from my neighbors, and luckily, that's exactly what I've got. But there's one exception. He lives in the opposite apartment and is around my age. He's not nosy or anything, but his actions do bother me and others. He doesn't have a stable job, and he spends all day doing silly stuff, filming it and posting it on social media. When he sees people reacting and commenting, he laughs out loud. His jokes are pretty loud and end up bothering everyone around him. One time, the hallway was filled with foam crumbs. They ended up blowing into my apartment and my neighbor's place next door. It even got in my throat while I was walking and talking on the phone. That was from one of his ridiculous challenges. I don't mean to judge anyone or their job, but in his case, he's causing trouble and discomfort for more than just me. He's asked me to be a guest on his challenge many times, but at that time it was 11 p.m. I was in my pajamas, and I couldn't have looked more annoyed. After that, I was really busy with work and wasn't home much. One afternoon, I had a dinner date with my girlfriend, so we decided to spend some time together. When I got back to my apartment, there was a huge package blocking the entrance to our garage. I didn't remember ordering anything, so I got out of the car and went over to check out the package. It was addressed to that neighbor who's always causing trouble, and it said it was a returned package. That meant he had sent the package, and for some reason, it was returned. I figured he bought the equipment for his video shoot. I moved it aside to clear the way for the car to get into the garage, and the package was insanely heavy. He must have bought a whole cow. I accidentally let go of it, and the package fell to the ground. There was a sound like plastic breaking. I was a bit panicked, but I quickly brushed it off. I figured I'd just tell him it was the carrier's fault, and that would be the end of it. I left the package next to the garage door, where it was covered by the roof. My girlfriend had just arrived, so we went inside, cooked together, and had a nice peaceful evening. The next morning we drove to work. As I passed the garage door, I was a bit surprised to see his package still there. Oh well, he'd see it anyway. I had a new project and was busy at work for 3 days straight. When I got back to the apartment after 3 days, I found the package still there. The cardboard box underneath was damp and a bit dented. I smelled something bad while I was still in the car. Someone in the building asked me, "Have you seen Dennis?" "I was at work. I just got home today," I said. "The bad smell has been there for a few days. Everyone's busy at work like me, so they don't notice. I have to deal with it by myself." I decided to deal with the package first. My neighbor was probably off doing some challenge somewhere. He'd been away from home for days like this a few times before. In the afternoon, after getting some rest, I grabbed scissors, gloves, and a bunch of large plastic bags and headed to the garage. The package was now leaking a red liquid, and it was swarming with flies. I wore 2 masks, but the smell was so strong it almost made me throw up a few times. I was fed up with dealing with the fallout from his ridiculous challenges, and now I had to clean up this mess from my neighbor. It had to be food he ordered to use later, which is why it smelled so awful. When I sliced the tape open, I saw a clear plastic box with something inside that I couldn't quite identify, but there were tons of maggots mixed in with some cloth. I tore off another piece of cardboard from the carton, bent down to take a closer look, and was met with the sight of a face being eaten away by thousands of wriggling creatures. I screamed and immediately called the police. 10 minutes later, the police showed up, took the package right away, and asked me to come down to the station to give a statement. After the forensic results came in, they concluded that the body in the package was my neighbor. He had died from suffocation. Another friend who often helped him with filming videos went to the police station to make a report. 2 weeks ago, he took on a new challenge. He was going to turn himself into a package and travel across the states. He packed some dry food, waste bags, and climbed into a plastic box. In the beginning, he still kept in touch with his friend and mentioned how much he was enjoying it. He could feel the shaking whenever the truck was moving. His friend was busy with work and forgot about it. The most unfortunate thing happened to this guy, who was way too young. The price he paid for his recklessness was just too scary. I hope no one else becomes a victim of pointless pranks, especially kids, with social media being what it is today. I'm really into exercising and playing sports, but since I spend most of my day working, running at night seems like the best option. In an evening, after wrapping up a ton of work, I grabbed a quick snack, changed into my running gear, and headed down to the park below my apartment to blow off some steam. The park was empty at the time, but suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I instinctively turned my head and was startled to see a tall, dark figure running behind me. I started running faster, and my heart was racing, out of control. But I could feel the person behind me getting closer and closer. My mind started racing with all sorts of worst-case scenarios. The more I ran, the faster I went, all flustered and panicked, with my heart pounding so hard it was tough to breathe. Not daring to turn around, I glanced to the side and saw the person's dark shadow falling onto the road right next to me. There was a couple being intimate up ahead, so I didn't hesitate to run over and shout for help. The girl in the beautiful white dress got up and walked over to me with a surprised look on her face. I gasped, turned around, and saw someone in a tracksuit running past. "Are you okay?" the girl in the white dress asked, looking worried. Now that I looked closer, she was really beautiful. She must have been on a date with her boyfriend. I gave a shy smile and thanked her. I curiously looked toward the boyfriend, but his face was hidden in the darkness, so I couldn't see him clearly. I thanked the girl again and left. Deciding to wrap up my jog, I was shocked to realize that my phone was missing. I froze for a few seconds trying to remember, and then realized I must have dropped it while trying to escape from my pursuer. I immediately ran back the way I came to find my phone. After searching around but still not finding it, I suddenly remembered the smartwatch I was wearing. Following the signal from the watch, I headed to the children's playground. But I had never run to this area before. Moreover, it was darker than the other areas. The playground equipment looked eerie and distorted in the darkness, creating strange shapes. The wind whistling through the dry branches, the chirping of insects, and even the weird sound of footsteps echoing in the dark. All of this turned what was usually a fun and lovely area into a place of horror and fear. I checked the signal on the watch again, and it definitely showed it was here. As I got closer to the playground, I heard music playing and was relieved to have found my phone. After wandering around the slide and seesaw for a while, all I could hear was the music from the phone. I turned around to look at the two swings a few meters away. I screamed in surprise, my heart racing and my head spinning. Someone was sitting on the swing on the left. "Who is it?" I said, my voice trembling like I was about to cry. That person didn't answer. The swing kept moving back and forth, the chains creaking, and the sound of water droplets slowly dripping made my legs feel weak. It looked like a girl in a long dress, but her back was turned, so I couldn't see her face clearly. My phone rang, and it was coming from that girl. She must have picked it up. "I dropped my phone with the pink case. Have you seen it around here?" The silence was still there, and it was haunting and unsettling beyond description. I slowly approached the girl. The phone rang even louder. Suddenly, the phone fell to the ground with a loud clatter, breaking the eerie silence. My whole body jumped. I quickly ran over and grabbed the phone right at the girl's feet. Holding the phone in my hand, I didn't have time to feel relieved. The phone was covered in a thick, fishy liquid. I was hit by that horrible smell for a few seconds. Looking down at where I'd just picked up the phone, I saw drops of water still flowing down, and the girl didn't react at all. I trembled, turned on the flashlight on my phone, and shined it toward the girl. She had tears all over her face, neck, and chest, and her eyes were wide open in panic. Her red dress was soaked, and each drop of liquid slowly flowed from her feet to the ground. It was the girl who had been with her boyfriend earlier. I ran as fast as I could, putting all my strength into it. I knew I had to get out of there quickly because that murderer could still be nearby. When I got to the security room, I collapsed and quickly told them everything in 2 sentences. The security guard and I stayed in the room until the police arrived. I told the police everything that happened, especially about that tall man. He was the top suspect in the case, but unfortunately, I couldn't see his face clearly. But on the flip side, he knew my face very well. He also knew where I was and might be lurking around. I asked the police for round-the-clock protection. I installed more security cameras, alarms, and a more modern door lock system to make sure everything was safe. For 2 months, I lived in fear and confusion and hardly left the house. By the 3rd month, the police announced they'd caught the guy while he was hiding in a neighboring state. I moved in with my parents because I felt scared and panicked whenever I was alone. I avoided all dark, dimly lit areas, parks, and even playgrounds. Once, when I went to the supermarket near my house and was playing on the counter, the cashier's eyes gave me the creeps. He was really tall, had dark skin, thick eyebrows, and was always wearing a pretty intense frown. He looked at me with a look of suspicion and anger. I'm Ryan, 25, and I live by myself in a cheap apartment in Boston. I didn't go to college. I moved out, got a job, and have been living on my own since I was 18. My family's not rich, so I just didn't want my parents to stress out over me. Even though I still live in the same city, I only visit home occasionally because I'm pretty busy. I used to work a bunch of different jobs before taking a short course in editing and filmmaking. It was my dream since high school, but I ended up giving it up. I was set on becoming a professional cameraman. I bought an expensive camera on installments and started posting my info and work on job sites. I didn't care about the salary. If someone reached out, I'd take the job to improve my skills. After almost a week of posting in all 15 groups, I didn't get any comments, messages, or calls. But I didn't give up. I kept looking for opportunities. And then I came across an article. They didn't require experience in filming, just that you be flexible with your time. And the pay was really generous. It felt like I'd just found the light switch in a dark room. Without hesitation, I texted the account that posted the job ad right away. My message was read within a second. But instead of responding to my greeting and introduction, that person went straight to the request. The visual needs to be sharp, especially at the climax. I thought he might be a guy who creates content for various platforms. This job was trendy at that time and wasn't too hard to do. Maybe he has an idea and needs someone to collaborate with. What kind of content are you working on? Can you do night shoots? Sure, if the content needs it. Can I see the script? I want to prepare as best as I can. 12 a.m., Friday. Last train at Park Street, subway station. The conversation didn't seem to flow together. That was the last message he sent, and he wasn't online or active on his personal account after that. Looks like this wasn't even the main account. 3 days later, I was still unsure if the appointment was actually going to happen. On Friday, I kept my eyes glued to my phone. I was really looking forward to this job since I needed the money. Around 10:30 p.m., I fell asleep on the sofa, and when the phone rang, It made me jump like a spring. Are you ready? My sleepy brain was trying to wake up and figure out what was going on. Red jacket, baggy pants, and black shoes. Look for me with this description. I still don't know your name. There was a long beep on the phone before I could finish my sentence. I quickly grabbed my stuff and headed to the meeting place. 11:30 p.m., I got to the subway station. It wasn't too crowded, but it wasn't empty either. It was mostly young people like me. Some were there for dates, some were rushing home, and some just wanted a spot to check their phones. I brought my camera, walked around slowly, and didn't see anyone matching the description the guy gave. After circling around and coming back to where I started, a bright red jacket caught my eye. Baggy pants and black shoes. It had to be him. I approached and he was wearing a huge hat that covered most of his face, plus a black mask. Maybe he didn't want to show his face in the video. I greeted him, but he just kept staring at his wristwatch. Can I get your name so I know how to address you? Get the camera ready and set up in that position. I didn't say anything more and quickly set up the camera. As I looked at him, it hit me that I might be getting caught up in some weird young adult nonsense. He kept checking his watch every 10 seconds, like he was waiting for some important moment. After almost 30 minutes like this, I had no idea what the heck I was doing there anymore. I walked up to him and said, I need to know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing here. He kept looking at his watch, then stood up and cut me off as he did. Get to your position and start filming when I give the signal. He quickly headed towards the train tracks. I went back to where I had set up my camera, adjusted the angle a bit, and kept an eye on his every move. He walked while checking his watch and stopped right at the edge of the tracks. He turned towards me, raised his hand to signal, and I pressed a button. That's when my job officially began. The train was coming from behind him with its siren blaring. At that moment, I thought to myself that this dude had some guts. I kept adjusting the angle and making sure it looked right. But then, he turned around and pushed a woman standing next to him. She fell towards the oncoming train, and then dark red blood mixed with pieces of flesh, a strong fishy smell, and screams. The scene was like a horror movie mixed with chaos, almost like something out of a mental hospital. I was frozen, and a few people ran into me in the camera. That guy had disappeared, and I realized I was involved with him. I was helping a murderer. Just like everyone else, I panicked and ran, leaving the camera behind. I sat in my room trembling non-stop as that scene replayed in my mind over and over again. The next few days I just hid in my house, feeling like a disgusting death row inmate. I was certain the police would show up any minute. My camera was left behind, with my fingerprints on it, and it had recorded everything clearly. There were moments when I thought about calling the police, confessing everything, and claiming I had nothing to do with the murderer. But who would believe me? A week passed and nothing happened. I kept up with all the news. The police were still investigating the case, but there was no mention of the camera. Living in constant anxiety left my nerves and body completely drained. This morning, 13 days after that horrible night, I got a package. It was pretty heavy, with my information on it, but no sender details. I opened it up, and it was my camera. There were a few scratches, but it was still in pretty good shape. There was a very thick white envelope inside, packed with cash, a total of $3,000. You did a great job. The video quality is very clear. Here's your payment. I'll need you for upcoming projects. Looking at the old, crumpled bills, I wondered if I had become his accomplice. I need to move, now, but I have to report this to the police. I can't let these dirty, scary things mess up my future. I'm Colleen, 25. I currently have a steady job in accounting. I met Cameron through a mutual friend. We quickly fell in love just a month after meeting. Partly because I was smitten by Cameron's good looks, and partly because he's so warm, genuine, and thoughtful. I even thought about marrying Cameron just 2 weeks into dating. The first 3 months of our relationship were definitely as sweet as a fairy tale romance. Cameron had a unique hobby that he was really passionate about. My 29-year-old boyfriend was really into fairy tales for kids at heart. He spent hours every day reading books and watching movies about fairy tale worlds. There were stories Cameron had read hundreds of times, knowing every detail, every word, every comma. I respected his hobby, especially since I'm a big bookworm myself. We usually went to the bookstore together once a week, for it was a good date spot. By the 4th month of our relationship, Cameron started showing some unusual irritability. Cameron yelled at me for picking up a fork before he sat down at the table. He constantly complained and got annoyed when I didn't put my glass on the coaster. I wasn't allowed to buy or eat anything that could make a mess or any food that made noise when chewed. Cameron, in particular, wouldn't come into the house unless the host came out to say hi and invite him in. He also insisted that I had to do the same. It would be very rude and even dangerous to do that on your own. The way Cameron laid down a set of rules for me was like a princess learning etiquette in a fairy tale, but the way he reacted when I didn't do things exactly right was like someone losing their mind. I started feeling incredibly uncomfortable in this relationship. I broke up with him several times, but he'd always kneel and beg for forgiveness, promising he'd change. He would say sorry for his foolishness, and I kept falling for it, over and over. But Cameron's controlling and irritating behavior just kept getting worse every day. It really took a toll on my mental health. One day, Cameron invited me over to his parents' house for dinner. My parents want to meet you because I told them you're as beautiful as Sleeping Beauty in the forest. I agreed to go to Cameron's parents' house. I thought maybe I could figure out how to deal with Cameron's behavior after getting some advice from his mom. The next day, Cameron took me shopping for a dress to wear for the dinner. I told Cameron it wasn't necessary since I already had plenty of clothes. A dinner at my boyfriend's house didn't need to be fancy. No, you need to look like a princess. My parents will really appreciate it. Appreciate? I repeated what Cameron said and stressed it when I saw him smiling. Don't be so harsh with your attitude and tone. It'll make you seem really rude. I didn't bother to respond to Cameron and just stared out the car window. I wasn't sure if it was the right choice to accept or not. As Cameron said, he took me to a store that had dresses just like the ones fairy tale princesses wear. Without letting me say anything, Cameron had me try on a bunch of dresses with layers and layers of heavy fabric. In the end, he brilliantly picked the most uncomfortable and heavy one for me to wear. I should have just left and ended it right there. I don't know why I have such incredible patience and endurance. Or was I just being stupid? After buying the princess dress, Cameron took me to a makeup shop. After sitting still for 3 hours, I looked at myself in the mirror and was amazed at how beautiful I looked. I didn't think I'd look as beautiful as Princess Aurora. Let's head home now and brush up on some more manners. Cameron's words felt like a hard slap to me. Cameron then quickly pulled me away. That night, instead of taking me to his parents' house, Cameron called a taxi for me. I'll go home and get everything ready with my parents to welcome you. I could see the taxi driver's eyes glancing at the rearview mirror every 5 seconds. I struggled to get out of the taxi in that heavy dress. Cameron's parents' house is a wooden house. and it's got a pretty fairy tale vibe to it. I walked up to the door to ring the bell and saw a note stuck above it. "Hey, my parents and I need to step out for a bit. It won't be long." The door was slightly open, so I walked in. I needed to sit down right away because my feet were going numb from the high heels. The inside of the house was pretty cozy. I sat down at a small wooden table and looked around for a bit. I was about to suffocate in this corset after wearing it for nearly 6 hours. I couldn't even tell if I was lying down or sitting, as long as it was comfortable though. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast until that evening. Seeing the plate of cookies on the table, I grabbed one to have before dinner. Crumbs fell everywhere, so I quickly stood up, brushed them off, and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I drank my water while checking out the kitchen utensils. They were irresistibly cute. I heard some noise from outside, so I quickly ran to the living room and sat down, thinking Cameron and his parents had come back. But no one was there. I sat and waited for a few more minutes, and then I suddenly heard a growl. Actually, it sounded like someone was trying to growl like a hungry lion. I stood up and looked in the direction where I thought the growl was coming from. A very unpleasant creaking sound came from the door of a room, and at the same time, it slowly opened. I was startled when 2 people in bear mascot costumes popped out from inside. Their faces were partially visible, but I couldn't see them clearly. They slowly approached me, still growling. I was really confused. I asked multiple times who they were, but they just kept up their strange behavior. I quickly ran towards the door, but another person in a bear mascot costume blocked my way. "Cameron?" I gasped when I saw Cameron's face peeking out from inside. "What is the meaning of this?"
You're going to be punished for not passing the challenge. You walked into a stranger's house without knocking. You ate cookies and drank water without asking. I especially don't accept your sitting posture.
The 2 people who just came out of that room were Cameron's parents. What on earth was going on? I was the invited guest for dinner. Why was my personality being tested? At my limit, I took off the crown from my head, threw it at Cameron, and shouted. Immediately, Cameron and his parents started roaring like they had lost their minds. They threatened to tear me apart, like the wicked characters in fairy tales who got their comeuppance. The eyes of those 3 were red and veiny, and their behavior was completely out of the ordinary. I was terrified and bolted out of the house. I took off my painful high heels, ran as fast as I could, and called the police. Now I understood why princesses always seem so slow and useless in emergencies like this. The dress was too heavy and cumbersome. Cameron's rough hands grabbed my hair and yanked me back. Luckily, the police arrived just in time to rescue me. I was in a terrible state, with torn clothes and bite marks all over my arms and calves. Cameron's family was taken to a mental health facility for treatment and detention. I was in shock and had to be hospitalized to have the bite marks carefully monitored. I was haunted by images of princesses, castles, and all that stuff. What if the police hadn't come in time? Would those people eat me alive? We've only been in this new house for a few months now. The house is out on the edge of town, not many people around, and there aren't a lot of amenities. But the air is really fresh. My room's on the first floor, near the living room, and my parents are upstairs. I picked this room because it's got a big window that looks out over the lake behind the house. I always leave the window open, and the breeze brings in the smell of flowers and grass, which makes me love the room even more. One night, I was up on my phone with my dog until after 2 a.m. I was watching a funny video and laughing when Pop suddenly jumped off the bed. ran to the window, and started barking like crazy. I jumped up and tried to get Pop to stop, or else my parents would wake up and realize I was still up, and they'd take my phone away. "Pop, stop it right now," I growled, but I barely whispered. At first I thought Pop was barking at his reflection in the window on the left. But when I looked again, Pop was staring angrily at the right side of the window. I took a closer look, and it was like a jolt of electricity went through me. Outside the window, a pair of blue eyes were staring right at me. It took me a few seconds to process it all, and I tried to act like everything was normal. I signaled Pop to be quiet, picked up the glass of water, and pretended it was empty. I slowly got out of bed and opened the door and went to the kitchen to get some water. "Pop, let's go get some water. You like snacks, don't you?" I swear, I had to keep my fear in check just to sound as normal as possible. I didn't even have time to worry about whether Pop was following me or not. I just rushed up to the second floor. I knocked on my parents' door over and over, freaking out and saying someone was lurking outside, probably a thief. "Calm down, Michael. I set up a sensor light. If there's any movement, the light will turn on." Dad was lying on the bed, sounding pretty calm as he answered me in a sleepy voice. When my mom heard my dad's explanation, her face relaxed too, and she let out a big sigh of relief. "Why aren't you asleep yet, Michael?" Mom suddenly switched her attitude and expression. I was startled and said, "I was thirsty, so I went to get some water. Good night, Mom and Dad." I quickly left. When I got back to the room, Pop was still sitting there, intently watching out the window. I went over and patted his head, saying, "It's nothing, buddy. Let's go to sleep." Looking out the window, everything seemed normal. I must have just been seeing things earlier. Pop was still sitting there, and I just went to bed and fell asleep pretty quickly. The next few days were normal, and I kept leaving the window open, just like before. I officially started summer vacation and planned to make a bunch of great memories with my parents and Pop in the new house. With my dad's okay, I'd often swim with Pop in the lake behind the house every afternoon. A few times I invited friends over to camp by the lake overnight, and everything went great. About 2 weeks into the vacation, one night, I stayed up late playing games with my friends. Suddenly, Pop's growling got my attention. He looked toward the window again, his eyes angry, showing his teeth and growling like he was ready to fight at any moment. I took off my headphones and said, "Pop, what's wrong this time?" I don't know why my heart was racing so fast at that moment. I looked towards the window and saw a pair of blue eyes. I stared carefully and kept looking back multiple times. But it was pretty dark outside, so I wasn't sure if I was seeing things correctly. I didn't dare to stand up and check, imagining that something terrible might happen to me. I felt pretty confident because I remembered what my dad said, but I was curious about Pop's reaction. "Michael, are you playing games again?" Mom's voice startled both me and Pop. I didn't answer because I heard noises coming from outside. Looking out the window, I was shocked to see a black shadow moving toward the lake. Pop lost it and started barking loudly. "Michael, I know what you're up to. Open the door now." I looked away from the window for a few seconds, and when I looked back, the black shadow had disappeared. I rushed to the window and looked around, but there was no one there. Mom's knocking got more and more urgent, so I ran to open the door and got a tongue lashing. But I couldn't focus on what my mom was saying, as I kept glancing toward the window, and the shadow of that creature seemed to linger in my mind. The next morning, I went to find my dad and told him everything with a real serious look. My dad was skeptical about what I said, so he decided to check the sensor light. and it had been broken for a while. The thought of some weird creature following me so many times really shook me up. I went into detail with my parents about its eyes and appearance, and how it suddenly vanished near the lake. Is it possible you were just hallucinating because you stayed up too late playing games, Michael? Mom's question made my dad hesitate and look at me with a questioning look. But Pop, how could a dog's senses be wrong? I immediately argued back, and my parents just looked at each other in silence and didn't say anything more. From that day on, I kept the windows shut and the curtains drawn all the time. My dad also installed a bunch of sensor lights and alarm bells around the house, just like I wanted. But I still couldn't relax and ended up dealing with constant insomnia. Seeing that my physical and mental health was getting worse, my parents took me to see a psychologist. The police also came by several times at night to search the house, but they didn't find anything unusual. One day, I suggested to my parents that we move to a different place. That same day, the local news reported that they'd finally arrested a thief who had been on the run for months. He'd committed a total of 36 robberies, and what stood out to me were his striking blue eyes. My parents thought it was very likely that I had seen him, but I still wasn't completely satisfied and didn't feel fully reassured. Following my wishes again, my parents decided to fill in the pond behind the house and build a big warehouse. While draining the pond, they found a bag and a mask that thieves often use. So, he probably jumped into the pond to escape that night. Since the pond wasn't very deep and he was tall, it makes sense he could have done that. I slept better and made sure to lock the door carefully every time. Luckily, I had Pop, a big and brave dog.